Hello, everybody. Welcome to this final panel on Sharp Power and Academy, Global Perspectives and American Scenarios. Today we have our third panel and final panel. It's about influential autocracies and open societies. Today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Thomas Kent. Thomas Kent is a former director of Radio Free Europe. He's an expert on Russian politics and Russian influence on media. We also have Juan Pablo Cardenal. He's an associate researcher at CADAL. Also with us is Orshan Selchuk. He's a visiting assistant professor at Luther College in Iowa. He's an expert on polarizing populism. Turkey, Latin America are some of his research interests. And also with us is Moises Garduño Garcia, who is a professor at UNAM in Mexico, and he's an expert on Iranian politics. So this is our final panel about Sharp Power and Academy. We are really interested in having this conversation, and each one of our speakers today will have between 15 and 20 minutes. After we have all this, all these presentations, we will have a Q&A part, and we are going to keep close eye on the chat box for any of your questions. So without anything else, let's just begin. We're going to start with Thomas Kent.
Thank you, Maria Isabel. Les digo good morning, damas y caballeros de Nueva York. Desgraciadamente, mi español no es tan fuerte como debería serlo, por lo tanto, les haré mis comentarios hoy en inglés. For the past couple of years, I've been talking to more than 160 specialists in a dozen countries for my research into Russian disinformation, with the focus on the best responses to Russian information operations in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. I did research in Argentina and Colombia and talked with academics and journalists in several other Latin American countries as well. One conclusion I reached early in my research is that there's nothing inherent in democratic values or even true facts that makes it inevitable that they will triumph in the so-called marketplace of ideas. I think a lot of people believe that somehow democratic values ultimately just have to win by some automatic means. But on the information, in the information conflict, we cannot depend on some ultimate epistemological justice to guarantee that democratic values triumph. Ultimately, much depends on the faith that we have in our values and the effort we devote to promoting them. I'm going to share today some of my thoughts about Russian information operations and influence in general in Latin America, and I'd be very glad to hear your comments, your perspectives, and your corrections to what I've come up with. Russian attention to Latin America has been episodic. During the Cold War, Latin America fit into the general Russian tendency to encourage left-wing movements, including armed movements worldwide. Of course, Latin America did not need Russia to have left-wing points of view. It had its own leftist forces. The pink tide, the giro a la izquierda in the 1990s and early this century came at a time when Russia was relatively inactive in international affairs, preoccupied with issues at home. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has resumed influence activities far from home, including in Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere. It doesn't have the economic strength and the unquestioned superpower status that the Soviet Union had. The GNP of Russia is somewhere between those of Brazil and Italy. Its population level is stagnant. It's seeing its skilled workers continually leaving the country for opportunities elsewhere. But in Latin America, it has tried to leverage the strength that it has using quite often information operations to advance its political goals, especially support for Venezuela and Cuba. They have been trying to forge military relationships, usually arms deals, with as many countries in Latin America as possible, and as many trade agreements as possible, very targeted trade agreements. These are often ways for Russia to get around US and European trade sanctions. Russia's not really in much of a position these days to subsidize trade deals. They have to be mutually advantageous. And many of the most lucrative deals from Russia's standpoint are, of course, in the energy and minerals sectors. The question always comes up, does Moscow look at Latin America as a continent in itself or through the prism of its relationships with the United States? Certainly, Russia would say that it seeks nothing but totally normal state relationships and mutual advantage with the countries of Latin America. It has a long history in Latin America. So I think they would reject very much the idea that their relationships in Latin America are just a way to put pressure on the United States. However, it's also true that in recent years, Russia has been convinced that the United States is plotting against it in its own backyard. It blames the 2014 Ukrainian revolution on the United States. It has not recovered from the incorporation of East Europe, most countries in East Europe, and most now in the Balkans, into NATO. So given that situation, one can imagine certainly that Russia sees Latin America as a place to threaten US interests and distract American attention from activity elsewhere in the world. Russia certainly needs some new allies in Latin America, with the Nicolas Maduro government under heavy pressure and Evo Morales gone from power. I'm very interested to hear from the other participants here what you think the Russians and the Americans can expect from Luis Arce in Bolivia. In any case, Russia has deployed in Latin America many of the influence tools that it uses elsewhere. It has RT in Espanol, Sputnik Noticias. It engages in heavy social network activity, some of it quite visible, some of it rather clandestine and unattributed. It seems to spike this social network activity during protests in countries where there's strong opposition to the Maduro government, during protests late last year, for example, in Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. And in Latin America, as we see in other regions, Russia is pretty content to deal with any potential ally. They're not that ideological these days. So if it makes sense, they can make common cause with leftists. If it makes sense in a given country or situation, they can make common cause with Catholic conservatives, wherever it can find sympathetic forces. Russia has a lot of assets, advantages in building influence in Latin America. Certainly, there's been a long suspicion there of the United States. Whatever it is, Russia isn't the United States. Of course, China isn't the United States either, and has a lot more money than Russia does. So anti-US sentiments, or sentiments in favor of balancing relationships, shall we say, with the United States and other parts of the world, these sentiments probably benefit Beijing more than they benefit Moscow. Latin American countries that feel very little heat or trouble from Russia are very wary of being dragged into a conflict between the United States and West Europe on one hand and Moscow on the other. So if Russia offers something that serves their purposes, Latin American countries are happy to take it without wanting to take some U.S. European hostile position to Russia. Latin American countries had long and bloody experience during the Cold War with coups and proxy wars that stemmed from the US-Soviet struggle, and they have nothing to gain from a new round of that. Several Latin American countries, as you know, did not support UN Resolution 68-262 in 2014, condemning Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. I think in the view of a lot of Latin American countries, this is just something, this whole thing is something they'd rather just keep out of. Judging by surveys, negative feelings about Russia are not universal in Latin America. Certainly, just for long historical purposes, for long historical reasons, the way education has worked, a lot of people do feel that Russia is a dictatorial country. But in a 2017 survey that I saw, 30% of Latin Americans, 30% agreed that Russia respects personal freedom. And only a quarter of Latin Americans think Russia is a major threat to their countries. And there was a 2018 World Cup. As you know, the large numbers of Latin America went to the 2018 World Cup in Russia, and they found it a nice place. Russia can be a nice place for foreign visitors. According to Professor Chaguaceda, as he's written, Kremlin media present Russia as an alternative of order and development in line with Latin American interests, as opposed to an imperialistic and decadent West, as the Russians would put it. Latin Americans may not be certain that Russia is a society they really want to aspire to, but if you look at CNN, and I assume that CNN in Espanol is something like CNN in English, if you look at that, you don't see a very pretty picture of the United States either. And lots of people, have their doubts about American society as well. Somebody told me, you can tell me if it's true, but somebody told me that one of the reasons that Turkish soap operas are so popular now in Latin America is that the American ones have so much sex and so much violence, and the Turkish soap operas are more about love and emotion, and that's more what people in Latin America are looking for. The Russians are very active on social networks, as I said, in Latin America, but what they do can get easily lost among all the other chaos on Latin American social networks from many other actors, including domestic actors. So it doesn't necessarily stand out. And Latin America is not like the United States, where everything that Russia does winds up on the front page of the Washington Post. From the distance of Latin America, Russia is just not something that everybody thinks about every day. And all this presents problems in countering Russian influence and in trying to build democratic societies in general. Traditionally, pro-democracy forces, pro-democracy parties have looked for a political center, but many countries in Latin America don't have a political center because there are leftist and rightist views of democracy that are so different. Russia can take advantage of both left and right. And pro-democracy actors have to navigate between these extremes, trying to find some measure of support for true facts and rational dialogue, and cannot be quite as flexible as Russia, because the pro-democracy actors have principles that they cannot compromise. The media, which is a strong counterweight, of course, to disinformation, is under pressure in Latin America, as it is everywhere else. Traditionally, the media has been the strongest bulwark for democratic government, or at least for rational discussion. But media face financial problems, and when they publish something that's false, even unintentionally, or antagonize readers in some other way, people flee to more fringe news sources, or just exchanging misinformation and disinformation on WhatsApp. And we're seeing that in the United States too. People are tending to leave more established news sources and go places where they can find content that's more in line with their personal views. But there are some positives in efforts to advance democracy. Surveys show that most people in Latin American countries still believe that democracy is the best form of government. Now, the overall percentage of citizens, this is from a 2018 to 2019 survey, the overall percentage of citizens saying that they prefer democracy declined from 68% in 2004 to 58% in 2018 to 2019. But you can hope that in most countries that tends to reflect discontent with the current government, not with democracy in general. I assume most people in Latin America do not dream of a military dictatorship or a surveillance society. Another positive against any overbearing moves by Russia is that Russia really needs friends. Russia has sort of fallen out of love with subsidizing guerrilla armies. It wants to have good relations at state level with as many countries as possible. China wants stability in Latin America too. So given its desire for normal state-to-state relations and its limited economic strength, this can rebound to the benefit of stronger Latin American governments in their dealings with Russia. They really have no need to be afraid of Russia, and they can feel free to call them out when their actions go over the line, because Russia at the moment may need Latin America more than Latin America needs Russia. So I hope that in the course of our conversation today, we'll talk a bit about ways of countering anti-democracy narratives, whether they come from Russia or elsewhere. I'd like to hear from others on the panel about the state of civil society organizations in Latin America, their strength or weakness in advocating for democracy. There's been an encouraging growth of fact-checking organizations in Russia, organized under the umbrella of news organizations or civil society groups. There are, I think, 42 fact-checking organizations now in Latin America, some of them extremely active. So I'm looking forward to conversation on that. And my other questions for you that perhaps you'd be interested in addressing is, as I said, I'm curious about the future of Bolivia. And I'm also curious the degree to which US government media like the Voice of America, VOA Noticias, have a footprint in Latin America or do not. We always talk about RT en Español and Sputnik Noticias, but what about La Voz de América? So I will stop there, and thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much. 15 minutes, so that was great. So next, yes, that's right. So thank you so much. Great start for our panel today. So next we have Juan Pablo Cardenal. So it's all yours.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation and allowing me to share my experience on China. And great presentation, Thomas, very good. Let me start with a very small disclaimer, if I may, in the sense that, I'm going to be talking about China. And I have to say, I was based in China for 10 years. I have followed, I've done on the field research in around 40 countries in the last decade, following China's footprint and trying to understand how China goes global and the impact of that to local populations, etc. But that said, I mean, it's a challenge always to discuss about China, more so doing that in 15 minutes or in our session of an hour and a half or 2 hours. But I'm going to do that effort. But I want to point out that I don't have answers for everything. I might be wrong in some things also. But of course, my views on China are based on my experience, on having lived there for so long, and also, of course, on my views of the world. That said, and focusing on China in Latin America, I think it's quite relevant to understand that only around less than 20 years ago, China was a secondary player in the region. And in the last 20 years or so, it has become the main player, or at least the main player for many of the Latin American countries in terms of trade, investment, loans, infrastructure projects, etc. So this has given China already a lot of political influence because of its presence economically. However, I think that this is something that China has gone global and is a big player almost in any region in the world. This is something that China has, and this is something that is not going to change. So I think what is relevant these days is not China's economic presence globally, which it is, but I think we have to take a much more attention is to how China is trying to gain political influence. And this is something that is very clear since Xi Jinping arrived in power in 2013. And more so, I would say in the last, since 2015, more or less, they have a very clear so-called soft, sharp power strategy. Not only, I would argue that it's a global strategy, but of course, China is very good at adapting locally. And in Latin America, which is the region that I've been following most, they have a very clear strategy on how to gain in political influence. Why is China doing that? I mean, I have a few reasons why China is engaged in such a thing. I'm gonna, in a minute, I'm gonna explain exactly what is this soft power strategy all about. But important to have in mind, why does China and the Communist Party has this kind of strategy? First is to push China's foreign policy objectives and interests. Second is to serve the purpose of to legitimate the Communist Party, both domestically and internationally. Also to gain support for the CCP's views of the world. That is relevant, and we will probably have time to discuss about that later on. It's relevant in the sense that China has already done has some projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, of course, it's a huge economic project, global, to create trade corridors around the world. But of course, it's also with those financial institutions that have been created and that are controlled by Beijing. It's a way of laying the foundation for a new alternative world order. So I think it's relevant to link this soft power strategy that it has with the fact that China wants to promote its views of the world, the CCP's views of the world. Also relevant, having a more general purpose of having friends and allies worldwide. And I would put that in the context of the asymmetric relationship that China has with most countries in the region. And of course, promoting, as I mentioned a minute ago, China's values, and eventually being able to lay the foundations of a new world order. So how does China pushes this kind of strategy? Basically through two means. One is through institutional cooperation or institutional engagement. And let me point out something. This is something that is happening globally. So geographically, it's all over the world, but also it's happening through different sectors. So when I say institutional engagement or cooperation, I'm talking about with the academia, I'm talking about the media, I'm talking about political parties. So how do they engage? For instance, with the media, they are trying, and they've succeeded in some countries, to close deals with media groups for content sharing and for producing content for televisions. That, of course, they say it's joint cooperation, joint productions, but it's all paid by Beijing, and of course, all the narratives included are the CCP and China's narratives. As Thomas was saying, with the pressure of the media almost everywhere, this kind of offer is working very well, because China is giving all of this for free, of course. In the sphere of academia, it's very clear the creation of the Confucius Institutes. There's around more than 500 around the world, more than 1,000 classrooms. In the region is over 40 Confucius Institutes and over 20 classrooms. So this is already quite relevant because they are, as everybody knows, it's institutions that are hosted by local universities. So it's a bit different from the British Institute or the Instituto Cervantes or the Alliance Française, etc. But also they are closing deals, academic deals with different academic institutions throughout the region. And again, the fact that the Chinese are financing all of those deals for investigation, for research, it's of course works very well. With political parties, let me give you one figure. The Communist Party, but let me tell you, by the way, that since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, the communist, the party was given like extra powers and extra resources. And in that sense, now it's always been like that, but now it's even more clear that the party is in charge. I mean, sometimes we focus very much on the state, but we need to understand that the state is subordinate to the party. And in that sense, in terms of foreign affairs, the party is clearly guiding China's foreign affairs and China's foreign affairs agenda. So the figure I was mentioning, China is already is doing around 40 interactions, activities, events with foreign political parties worldwide per year. So this is quite outstanding. I say they've invited one of the last meetings in Beijing and in Shenzhen with over 300 representatives of I don't remember the figure right now, but over 100 political parties of all over the world. Invited by China, invited by the party. They are there a few days, and then they end up signing some kind of joint declaration, which is, of course, created and written and everything by the party. So this is something that very much helps to legitimize the CCP worldwide and the views of the CCP. So money in this sense is working very well in this strategy. And then the second thing is what's been called the elite capture. So China identifies in most of the countries where they are invested, the people that are influential locally. Those could be opinion leaders, it could be scholars, it could be politicians, former diplomats, and what they do basically, they send them, they invite them to China in order to, and they show them the beautiful China. They fly in business class, they stay in 5-star hotels, they take them to the party headquarters, they take to a meeting in Huawei or in Alibaba, they take them to the Great Wall with those feasts and this hospitality that the Chinese have, they are great on that. And they are able to pass along the views of the country, the views of the party. And this is and this is relevant in the sense that, I think it's a key factor, that the fact that China is investing all those resources and this money to capture those elites, in combination with the lack of knowledge that you have everywhere in the world, I would argue, but specifically in Latin America, regarding what China is, China's history, China's political system, etc. I think it works very well for China's objectives. And what's happening basically is that many of those people that are engaged with the Chinese, they have become informally ambassadors of the Chinese cause, if you allow me the word. So they are supporters of the Chinese view, and they do that in their own countries when they come back through their speeches, public speeches or public statements, through their op-eds that they write or whatever, And myself, I've been with many of those elites, interviewing them, you can always hear, and this is quite relevant, I would say, this echo of those elites being quite impressed with China's modernization of the last 40 years, and they put it as a proof somehow that development without democracy is possible, and this is, of course, China's transition from Maoism to red capitalism is always it's always shown as a proof of this. But also you have all those numbers of the Chinese miracle having grown at a 9% rate through the last in the last 3.5 decades. But then you also have things like how China was the only big economy that was able to pass through the 2008 crisis relatively untouched. And now with the pandemic, it's happening something exactly quite similar. I'm reaching my 15 minutes. I have something else that I wanted to mention, but I can save it for later, which is basically, and this is something many people have asked me when I talk about this, is in what sense what the Chinese are doing is different from the soft power of the other countries, of the Western countries or whatever. Let me say something just to finish. Soft power, according to the classic term of Joseph Nye, is about persuasion and about attraction, convincing others through those means. And I'm not saying that this strategy that China has does not have elements of soft power. It does. The problem is that it's all, I can give examples of why this is different from the Western soft power. But more generally, this soft power becomes sharp power because it's not benign. It's all those values that are embedded in the Chinese authoritarian system. You can see them when China develops or deploys this strategy, this soft power strategy in Latin America and elsewhere. I think with that, I leave it there, and maybe I have the option of elaborating on this later on.
Thank you. You were on time as well. Thank you. So now it's Orchan's turn. So the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Orchan Selçuk. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Luther College in Iowa. Just a disclaimer, my main area of research is not Turkish-American relations, but I do study various themes, comparative themes between Turkey and Latin America. I'm currently working on my book on polarizing populism in Turkey, Venezuela, and Ecuador. So there is a autocratization component of my research. Another line of my research had to do with Turkish Airlines and how Turkey is using Turkish Airlines as a soft power tool around the world. So this presentation in that sense will be at the intersection of my current book project as well as my previous research on Turkish foreign policy, soft power, and Turkey's opening to different areas, including the Middle East, the African continent, as well as Latin America. Okay, so in my presentation, I will first talk about the outline, the things I'm going to be focusing on, and then I'm going to go through each section one by one. So I'll first briefly talk about Turkey's opening to Latin America, what that means, and then I will focus on the diplomatic relations between Turkey and Latin American countries, and then I will focus on commercial aspect of Turkey's opening to Latin America, and then cultural issues, and then I want to address the theme that other speakers have been focusing on, which is, I think, autocracy promotion. Before I start the sections, I want to make or put forward my thesis that Turkey's opening to Latin America is less about autocracy promotion, and it's more about, you know, developing diplomatic, commercial, and cultural relationship. That is mainly because Turkey's geographical distance, its, you know, lack of capacity to fully engage Latin America in an authoritarian, autocratic form. So I will elaborate those in my presentation right now. So when you focus on Latin America, or when you talk about Latin America in the Turkish context, the first thing that obviously comes up is the limited, you know, relations due to the geographical distance. As you know, Turkey is located in the intersection of the Middle East, Caucasus, Southern Europe, Balkans. So it is, you know, pretty far from Latin America or South America, Central America, whatever sub-region you want to focus on. But in the Latin American context, we have this phenomenon of los turcos, right? So in the Latin American context, there is these mainly Christian Arabs that migrated from the Ottoman Empire to various Latin American countries. So in that sense, in the Latin American context, Turkey has been, you know, being Turkish, Turco, has been, you know, a daily usage. But that has actually nothing to do with contemporary Turkey, but mainly people, mainly Arabs, Jewish Armenians that migrated to Latin American countries like Brazil, Argentina during the Ottoman period. But there had been, during the Ottoman Empire, some attempts to form diplomatic relations with the region, but they were mainly limited. And again, as I said, that was mainly because of the geographical distance. During the Cold War period, Turkey, as you know, was in the NATO alliance. It was bordering the Soviet Union. So it was very much preoccupied with defending the free world, the so-called free world, against the communist aggression against the Soviet Union. So it was one of the most important countries within the NATO alliance because of its, you know, geographical proximity. So in that sense, anti-communism was a main ideology in Turkey. But at the same time, the leftist intellectuals in Turkey put a lot of emphasis or developed interest in Latin American revolutions like the Cuban Revolution or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, right? And there was also in Turkey during the Cold War several urban guerrilla movements, you know, similar to Tupamaros in Uruguay, Montoneros, you know, in Argentina. So there were, similar to Latin American instances, Turkey also had urban guerrilla movements, which also led to military takeovers. So even though Turkey and Latin America did not have, you know, direct close relationship during this period, in the Cold War context, they shared, you know, the rise of radical student movements and the militaries, pro-American militaries, basically, you know, basically suppressing and oppressing these movements and, you know, governing as a military regime. So in that sense, Turkey had similarities with countries like Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, in terms of, you know, how they had military regimes governing in the 1970s and the 1980s in the height of the Cold War. The other issue that got Turkey's interest during the Cold War is the recognition of the Armenian genocide by some Latin American countries. In fact, Uruguay is the first country in the world in 1965 that recognized the Armenian genocide, which is one of the main pillars of Turkish foreign policy to lobby against the efforts of the Armenian diaspora living in different parts of the world, including Latin America, but also places like France, you know, California, where the Armenian diaspora has been very, very strong. So that has been other interest of Turkey when it comes to Latin America. But I would argue that in the Turkish public's perception, Latin America was mainly perceived from a cultural perspective. That's why I put the picture of Maradona with Fidel Castro, because Turkey basically through sports, through music, through Brazilian soap operas, had perceived Latin America from a more cultural rather than a political political lens. So a lot of people followed Maradona, a lot of people followed Pelé, you know, they supported Brazil, Argentina, maybe they followed a couple of beauty pageants, but they didn't really, you know, focus on Latin America as a political, you know, political region to develop political relationships. But this did change in the post-Cold War period when Turkey realized that it doesn't have to form a foreign policy just based on being pro-US. Even though it was a NATO member, even though it wanted to become an EU member, Turkish foreign policy, and this was before the rise of Erdogan in the 1990s, developed this multi-dimensional foreign policy strategy, meaning Turkey shouldn't just be a Western-oriented country, meaning pro-European, pro-American, but it should also discover Central Asia, it should discover Africa, it should discover Latin America. So the Turkey's opening to Latin America came in this context of post-Cold War setting to move beyond just being a NATO ally, just move beyond being a EU candidate. So in this context, in 1998, Turkey adopted the first action plan towards Latin America and the Caribbean. And again, this was before the ruling Justice and Development Party came to power. I want to emphasize that because I don't want people to have the assumption that Turkey discovered Latin America all of a sudden with Erdogan, right? Before Erdogan and the AKP came, Turkey had some plan. But in 2006, Turkey declared the year as the year of Latin America and the Caribbean. Just to give you some context, 2005 was the year of Africa, which basically shows Turkey's, you know, willingness to engage other regions than Western Europe, North America, but basically to position itself as a global player that has its diplomatic presence, you know, commercial presence, cultural presence around the world. So since 2006, and especially 2010, so in the last decade or so, Turkey has, you know, increased its number of embassies. For example, in 2010, Turkey only had 6 embassies in the region. Right now, it has 17 diplomatic representations, I think 16 embassies, and then 1 consulate general in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And currently, also, Turkey is in the process of opening new embassies in Uruguay and in El Salvador. So Turkey is, in other words, engaging Latin America more and more by opening new embassies, by developing more diplomatic relations. But this is also nothing exceptional. So similar to the presentation on China, this is part of a global strategy. Turkey actually is very high ranking. If I'm not mistaken, after the 5 permanent representatives of the United Nations Security Council, Turkey is one of the leading countries when it comes to the number of diplomatic representations, representations in Africa, in Latin America. So this is again part of a broader strategy of investing in embassies in multiple capital cities around the world. The other aspect, again, of this is basically high-level diplomatic visits. Here in the picture, you see Turkish foreign minister and the Bolivian foreign minister in Ankara, in the office of the Turkish foreign minister. So again, in the 2010s, for example, Turkey was visited by Latin American leaders like Dilma Rousseff, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, Rafael Correa, Sebastián Piñera, Juan Manuel Santos, Peña Nieto. So, which means Turkey, again, is not just engaging a certain leftist or right-wing actor. Turkey is engaging a broad variety of actors in Latin America. Erdogan, since he became president in 2014, and he was a prime minister before, he visited Cuba, Colombia, Mexico. In 2016, he went to Chile, Peru, Ecuador. And as you know, as most of you are, I think, familiar, he has been also to Venezuela since the development of relations between him and Nicolás Maduro. So in other words, Turkey's engagement with the region has a diplomatic opening, which has the embassies as well as high-level visits. Obviously, linked to this, Turkey is also increasingly engaging regional organizations like the Organization of American States, SICA, Mercosur, CARICOM or ECLAC. So in that sense, Turkey is fully, trying to develop relationship with not only bilaterally, but also multilaterally. But one aspect of Turkey's engagement with Latin America, relatively unknown, not directly under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it was originally under the Prime Ministry office and then the Turkish presidency, is the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, which has between 2008 and 2018 has carried out 172 projects in Latin America. And these projects include education, healthcare, agriculture, infrastructure. And during the COVID-19 crisis, also Turkey donated medical aid to countries like Paraguay, Venezuela, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. So in that sense, it's not just embassies, it's not just consuls, but it's also through humanitarian aid, developmental aid. Turkey is engaging the region. Here I included some pictures. On the left, upper left, you'll see Turkey basically helping the a Colombian school. Basically, Afro-Colombian students are basically getting help after a flood incident in Colombia, and their school is getting some school supplies, basically gift of donation of Turkey. Overall, I also included a chart here, 172 projects, 15 healthcare, 34 education, agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, Turkey not only engages in a more diplomatic, but also through foreign aid, through developmental aid, engaging Latin American people, not only governments, throughout the region. And TICA, this office has two main offices in Mexico City and in Bogota, which is again linked to Turkey's engagement of both Central America as well as South America. To talk about the commercial aspects of Turkey's opening to Latin America, there has been an increasing trade volume in recent years. In 2000, the beginning of the millennium, Turkey's trade volume with the region was $880 million. In 2008, this reached to $11.8 billion. So Turkey is basically multiplying its trade volume with Latin America. Latin America is not Turkey's main trading partner. It's not, indispensable for Turkey, but it is definitely a region to diversify Turkey's, portfolio, to encourage Turkish businessmen to, engage in commercial activities around the world. And again, this is not anything unique to Latin America, but this also happens in Africa. This also happens in the Balkans. How much time?
You already have 15 minutes, so if you want to take the 5 extra.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So sorry for going over the time. Among these trading partners, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico are the top. 3 billion Brazil, Colombia 1.7, Mexico 1.3. Just to briefly complete this slide, whenever Erdogan travels to a country, he establishes a business forum. So Turkish and, let's say, Paraguayan, business people, they start relations. Turkish Airlines, starts new flights. Currently, Turkish Airlines flies to Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Havana, Caracas, Mexico City, Cancun, and Panama City, as well as Bogota in the region. And one aspect of, again, Turkey's engagement with Latin America commercially is the G20. As you know, Turkey is a member of G20, and it prioritizes relationship with other G20 members in the region, including Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, also large economies that will have a diverse portfolio for Turkey. Thomas mentioned in his presentation the cultural aspect. The popularity of Turkish telenovelas, or the soap operas, is definitely one aspect of Turkey's engagement with Latin America, which even makes people give Turkish names like Onur or Elif to their children in Latin America, which has become more of a cultural way to engage the region, which is linked to increasing number of Latin American tourists in Turkey, because people watch Turkish telenovelas, because there's availability of Turkish Airlines flights. More people are coming to Turkey from from Latin America. The other way Turkey engages Latin America is through Muslims in Latin America. So Turkey is basically positioning itself as one of the leaders of the Muslim world, and I'm interested in what the presentation on Iran would say, because there's a Sunni versus Shia aspect there. And then there is also sports ambassadors, Latin American sports players, athletes playing in Turkey. In the picture here, you'll see Radamel Falcao and Fernando Muslera. Falcao is from Colombia. He plays for Galatasaray. Muslera, as well as the Uruguayan goalkeeper, plays in Galatasaray. There are other sports players like Ecuadorian Ener Valencia, Jose Sosa. There is the Peruvian Cueva. So there's all sorts of cultural interactions going on at the sports level. Also, Turkish people watch Latin American, stories like Narcos, which is very popular in Turkey. So a lot of people, watch Pablo Escobar, and then Colombia, which is again a negative portrayal of Colombians, but at the same time, it I think shows increasing interest in the region. So since I'm running out of time, I want to address the autocracy promotion aspect of Turkey's relations with Latin America, and I'm happy to also elaborate this in the Q&A. I would argue that in this broader framework, Turkey's relationship with Venezuela has been more pragmatic than ideological. One socialist and the other is an Islamist leader. They just, bonded after the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, because Maduro was one of the first leaders who condemned the coup in Turkey. And Erdogan's mistrust in the United States and getting closer relationship with Russia basically helped Turkish Venezuelan rapprochement. But I would say this is rather not a autocracy promotion, but again, more of a pragmatic partnership, which definitely gives a lifeline to the Venezuelan regime. But I don't think it's the main reason why the Venezuelan regime is alive and surviving. I think the Turkish support is rather complementary to other actors like China and Russia, which are, I think, the main, and as well as Cuba, main external actors that are helping Maduro to stay alive. The Venezuelan relationship, as well as Turkey's overall, I think, opening to Latin America has to be balanced between Turkey's relationship with the US and Russia. Whenever Turkey gets closer to the United States, we should expect Turkey to take a distance approach to Maduro, distance approach to Venezuela. But whenever Turkey gets closer and Erdogan gets closer with Putin, then we should expect closer and more pronounced relationship with Venezuela. So overall, I would argue, and I will be happy to go into the Venezuela, and I'm almost done, Venezuela aspect. I think Turkey overall emphasizes soft power tools in the region. It has limited ability to project hard power beyond the Middle East and North Africa. An overall goal of Turkey's opening to Africa, Latin America, is to boost Turkey's centrality, attraction, and image, rather than promoting an autocratic way of life or style of politics. I'm sorry to go over time, but I'm happy to answer questions if you have anything that you want me to elaborate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Orchun. So our next and final speaker will be Moises Garduño. The floor is all yours, Moises.
Thank you very much, Marisabel. Thank you to my colleagues for, I was saying thank you, Marisabel. Thanks to my colleagues, Pablo, Professor Sergiuk, and Professor Thomas, for your insightful ideas. First of all, I want to thank also Professor Chavaceda for the invitation. It's a very good panel, and we have many, many resonances with every single talk that you have done this morning. Talking about Iran and Latin America is very difficult because it's important in terms of methodology, go by one by one. It's not the same talking about Iran and Venezuela relations that, for example, Iran-Mexico relations. So it's very difficult because the landscape changes a lot in terms of relations, in terms of temporality, and in terms of intentions. So what I want to do this morning in these minutes that I have is just to propose a panoramic, a general panoramic about these relations, talking about the public discourse of Iranian politics through mass media and in a specific way to Hispan TV, which is the most important tool in terms of sharp power that Iran has implementing in Latin America from some years ago. But before talking about Hispan TV, I would like to point it out about the theory. It's important to talk sharp power now in politics. Yes, because we have a paradox. We have a paradox. The paradox is that democratization offers space in which mass media from authoritarianism or from authoritarian regimes can include themselves in the struggle for audience in the global public sphere. So this is the paradox. Democratization in the globalization processes open this space for autocratic mass media. And talking about what many authors like Manuel Castells, for example, have done about power and communication, we have to say that power is in the mind. And in the digital age in which we are, it's very important for every single government around the world have a very good image of itself in the public sphere. Mass media, internet, global networks now are the most important tool, not only to persuade, as my colleagues were saying, but also to seduce the image of my country in the public sphere. According to Castells, seducing with a very, single morality, an image of myself is going to be a very useful tool to govern and to be accepted by others. Talking about this lack of knowledge about the authoritarian regimes in Asia from Latin America. The images of Middle East countries in Latin America used to be very exotic, very far from Latin America, not only geographically, but also ideologically, exoticized just like terrorists, as fanatics, as criminals, mainly from the 9/11 events. And now these regimes in the Middle East have to fight this image in not only in American and Europe audiences, but also in Latin America. So we have a statement from my very dear colleague and friend, Hamid Dabashi, who used to say that if you want to criticize American politics, you have to watch Russia TV. If you want to criticize Russia, you have to watch CNN. If you want to criticize Iran, you have to watch Al Arabiya. And if you want to criticize Saudi Arabia, you have to watch Press TV. This is more or less the way in which these mass media work right now in the struggle for audience around the globe. So talking about Iran and public discourse, we have to distinguish between the public discourse inside Iran and the public discourse outside Iran. So in terms of inside politics, of domestic politics, we have to mention at least 4 elements. Mahdism, is one of the most cultural ideology inside politics, in which the Iranian regime wants to control what the people believe about the Mahdi. Mahdi and the state apparatus can be united in the public discourse in Iran, considering the confidence of Iranian people who believe in the Mahdi as one of the most important support from the very same regime. Another important element in the public sphere for the Iranian discourse is the chaos in the Middle East, a kind of state of fear in which the people in Iran is usually hearing in the radio or in TV that if you don't want to be with the government, you have to look at what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Iraq, what is happening in Yemen, And if you don't want to be like they in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and so on and so forth, so you have to be obedient with the government, and you have to be calm, and you have to, contain all of these kind of crises that we have inside the country, talking about specifically economic crisis. Another element of the public discourse is the use of anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism with a very key element of nationalist element in Iran. Anti-American politics, you have, maybe you can watch in the murals in the main streets in cities like Tehran. Every month in the Valley Azer Avenue, you have the big picture of what is fashionable about anti-American politics, considering the heritage of Iraq war, considering the Cuba, politics by Washington. And this is a kind of very good element to persuade people that revolution is alive in Iran. This is another important element. Those three elements are very important to say and to justify the role of the most important political actor in the domestic politics in Iran, which is the Pasdaran, the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard controls economy, security, communication, and now is controlling cultural politics inside the country. And considering these three elements in the public discourse in Iran, we can consider them as all of these elements unified to make a justification of Pasdaran role in politics. But what happened to outside Iran? The public discourse changes in terms of global public sphere. The main elements that I want to share with you in order to try to understand this tool can be, for example, the nuclear program, trying to shape the nuclear program as a peaceful tool in order to create even more democracy in the Middle East and balance of power between Iran and Israel, and not as a quest for a nuclear bomb. An anti-Saudi and anti-Israel, anti-Zionist discourse also for outside, pro-European, consensus, pro-China, discourse, and also to make another paradox in terms of public discourse, which is the most pro-democratic international system, not this universalist, pro-Huntington, pro-American hegemony around the world, but kind of pluralism in the international system. 1 month ago, Minister Javad Zarif offers a 3-day conference in the University of Tehran talking about the new world order. And one point that he made emphasis in was the pluralism in which every single country in the international system has to have a role in the democratization and in this new perception. This is a kind of public discourse in Iran in terms of foreign affairs. And in Latin America, in very specific way, we have the tool of Hispan TV and Press TV, as the main elements to produce this discourse in Latin American audiences. And now in Latin America, we have some other elements that change in comparison what we have in Europe and in other parts of the world. Anti-Trump ideas, mainly in the last 5 or 4 years, the overstate of American mistakes in global politics, the support of protests against pro-American governments in Latin America, a kind of, speech as, again, American intervention and American heritage in Latin America, and of course, the soccer, which is resonance with Professor Seljuk was saying about how the soccer in Latin America can be a very smart and useful tool for sharp power in terms of politics. So in terms of academia, which is a very important topic, contrary to what Juan Pablo was mentioning in China about the strategy of China to locate, very important elites to produce and reproduce this Chinese discourse, In the case of Iran in Latin America, they can to take young scholars with any experience about politics, but who are people who are in the quest for one space in the public sphere, in the commentocracy, in the programs in the global sphere. You know, one interview in the mass media for them is very important. So this is the kind of people that, in my view, Iran and Press TV and Hispan TV are looking for in order to produce a counterbalance to these classic speakers in the public sphere, the classic images that we have in CNN, in other mass media, with many years of experience in Latin America. And this is a strategy in which Iran is trying to play a very good role, challenge the classical influencers in the TV and now in internet. So maybe one another element in terms of academy is one goal that Iran have in Latin America, which is the insertion of Iranian institutions in Latin America. This is an important strategy that Iran is making in Africa, for example. In Africa, Iran is spending billions of dollars providing free social services through vast network of hospital, running infrastructure and social justice, Islamic schools, seminars, and other kind of financial help. But Tehran, in the middle of this strategy, is trying to increasing the effort of some clerics in Iran, some Islamic institutions like Islamic Assad University in Africa, like, for example, the Mustafa University, which is one of the most important universities in Iran, to make some connections in Africa. I think one of the most important strategies in Latin America is something similar, but not in all of the states, not all in the governments. The main strategy is implemented in Venezuela, for example. The kind of connections between Iran and Venezuela are very high, not only in commercial ways, in trade, but also in intelligence, in oil research. And now, in terms of cultural view, it's very important to keep in mind this strategy to make connections with these institutions in order to produce more sharp power, made in Iran, but produced in Venezuela. So now we have, and I will finish here because maybe we have take advantage of time for Q&A section, but we also have a very important issue inside Iran. Iran is not only the regime public discourse. Iran is a very important country with many intellectuals in the diaspora and inside Iran, but discussing these kind of topics out of the universities, in public spaces, in cafes, in very important meetings, in private spaces also. And the production of knowledge of these kind of intellectuals are very important in order to make counterbalance of this public discourse in Iran. I call it this anti-academia discourse inside Iran. And these kind of discussions are very high level. They promote important scientific articles, scientific papers in very important journals around the world with no real names. And the very level of discussion is very high. And this is also another part of Iranian academia and the strategies of counter public discourse that we have to follow in the next years in order to make a critique and self-critique of this kind of experience that we have in Iran. Thank you very much again for the invitation. I'm very open for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On time. So we're going to start in the same order we began the presentation. So the first question is for Thomas Kent. How can you make counter influence from Latin American civil society and in broader terms from societies in general against the Kremlin's narratives?
Okay. There's a lot that one can do, but let me focus on just one element in particular. And that is, I think that pro-democracy organizations need to learn to work more in the language of ordinary people. I think we find a lot of pro-democracy forces, so to speak, are think tanks issuing 10 megabyte reports, and their academic groups, and meanwhile we have people like RT and Press TV and so forth, speaking in many cases much more in a people's language, with a tone and vocabulary and approach that attracts ordinary people. So it's a question of language. It's also a question of aggressiveness. And this is a question, and it may change from country to country or from population segment to population segment. But do we want the voices of democracy, the voices against totalitarianism, to be sometimes a little rough and snarky and tough, the way pro-authoritarian voices often are? Or are we going to try to occupy some moral and linguistic high ground and not get involved in this on the theory that ultimately, good sense and good manners will win out? It's just a question. You can imagine arguments on all sides.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the second question for Juan Pablo. Could you explain a little more about the Chinese Communist Party's influence on academic environments across Latin America?
Well, as I mentioned before, the flagship tool or institution is the Confucius Institutes, where they are, as I said, hosted by the local universities in campus, and we cannot think of them as being like independent institutions or anything like that. Those are institutions that are controlled by the party, and therefore everything that is taught, from language to history to culture, etc., is exactly the party line. That, I would say, that is the flagship institution. But then you have research cooperation deals with both universities and think tanks. They basically come with the money, and they have with specific institutions, they design and develop a research project, which they typically it would be financed by the Chinese. Then we have the scholarships, trainings, and the fact that they also develop a close relationship with the sinologists. In terms of scholarships, of course, when China announces figures, you never know exactly what that figure captures. But there's this figure given by Xi Jinping himself a few years back, saying that China would train around 10,000 Latin American leaders. When they say leaders, we can think that anyone could fit in that category, But basically, I think it's scholars and students and journalists and other people, and also politicians. I would argue. But of course, there's a very thin line between people that are granted with scholarships to study in China for a long period, and what they call trainings. Trainings in the Chinese language is a completely different thing to what we understand of a training in the West. It can last a couple of weeks or even months, but of course they would basically it's exposing these people to the Chinese propaganda. In this relation, two things that I think are important. In having a close relationship with the sinologist, I want to put it in the context that I mentioned before of the lack of knowledge that you have in the region, in Latin America, among the elites and of course among the general population. If I would have, of course there are many exceptions, but if I would want to identify a group that would be an exception to this, of course it comes from the academic world and more particularly the sinologists. The problem with the scholars that follow China, that have devoted their careers to China, is and it's again it's relevant because these are one of the very few people in the region that really understand China, is that they face another kind of pressure, which is self-censorship, because of course the Chinese regime has made it very clear to these people that they are risking their career, or at least they are risking their future access to China and to Chinese sources and to Chinese colleagues if they are very open and clearly and publicly critical of China. So this is something that I mean, I've experienced it myself, you know, having a private conversation with some of those scholars that understand China very well. They speak perfect Mandarin, etc. And they have a discourse in private that is not exactly the same as the kind of stuff that they produce, you know, academic publications or whatever, you know. And I can tell when reading some of that work, I can identify this criticism, but they do it in a very subtle way, you know, precisely because they don't want to be cut off from China in any way. The other thing is that all those universities and counterparts and think tanks that have those deals with China, I think it's also relevant that, in my experience, that many of them, or a number of them, they don't know exactly who their counterparts are. You know, I mean, because they look as if they are part of civil society, they tend to see them as independent institutions with independent researchers. And I'm not saying that the Chinese are not like that. What I'm saying is that many of those Chinese think tanks and academic institutions, even if formally they don't belong to the party, or they don't belong, or they even look as if they are independent institutions, in practice they are not. I mean, this is something that we need to understand. They follow the party line, or at least they never go against the party line. And all of this to say that the whole purpose of engaging with the academic world in such a way is basically to monopolize the discourse of what China is and what China's history and Chinese culture is. You know, I think this is relevant also because the Chinese regime believes that the image that China has is not the right one, and this is an image that has been shaped by the Western media, and they are passing along a narrative in order to promote Western values that are hegemonic values and also Western interests. So all of this, and I think, in my view, it's being very successful for this combination of the Chinese money plus the lack of knowledge and Chinese resources, etc., is working very well also in the academic world. I mean, it's very, very difficult to find narratives that are openly critical of the party line, basically.
Thank you very much. So the next question is for Orchun, and it is, could you talk a little bit more about cultural presence in Latin American countries, about the success of TV soap operas, for example? They only reflect a market operation. Do they only reflect a market operation, or are they a supported by some agency, and do they respond to some agency or objectives that the Ankara government has?
Yeah, so with regards to the soap operas, most of them are actually private companies, but there is a state-owned, TRT component. So the Turkish government funds some of these soap operas that aim to promote a neo-Ottoman, soap operas. So, for example, when Maduro visited Turkey, he is, this big fan of this show called The Resurrection, which is a Turkish TRT production, which are also not only seen in Latin America, but also in the Middle East and the Balkans. So the main target is rarely Latin America. It's more broader, right? It targets people in Bosnia, people in Macedonia, people in, Jordan. But there is, if it's by the Turkish government, I think it has the neo-Ottoman, basically making Turkey feel this grandeur, this great country, and, it's, being a successor of an empire. I also think part of it, it's also not people living in Latin America, but also Latinos in the United States are also, I think, big fans of these TV shows. Telemundo shows, some of these TV shows as well. Based on also my personal experience, I can tell you that, a lot of people watch these shows and then they, reach out to me saying, oh, like I watched this Turkish show, I want to go to Turkey. When I was in Turkey, I saw, when I was visiting the main, historical landmarks, I saw a lot of, Colombians, visiting Hagia Sophia. And so I think a lot of this has to link with the cultural appeal. And also when we were in Turkey, my wife is Honduran. Her mom's friends asked for souvenirs from Turkey, mainly because they watch, Turkish soap opera. So it's not just, I think, people living in Latin American countries, but also Latinos in Florida and different parts of, the US are, I think, attracted to these soap operas, which are, I think, interesting. There's also the social media component. When I look at these, characters, there's this child, this actor in one of these TV shows called Todo por mi hija. And then when I look at her Instagram, like it's all like comments are all in Spanish. So I think there's also that social media element. One of the anchor women in Telemundo, Maria Celeste Araraz, I remember, I know her personally. She went to Turkey with her mom because her mom wanted to visit Turkey, and then she shared like stories, Instagram stories. So I think that's all part of the cultural reproduction of, perception of Turkey. And I think in Latin America, with the exception of the Venezuelan opposition, Turkey is not seen as an autocratic, authoritarian country. It's seen as, this attractive country which mixes Islam and modernity, family drama, similar traditional family relationships that are different than the Netflix shows, which, all have LGBT characters. So I think there is like a lot of, overlap culturally over family drama and, this love affairs. And part of it is government funded, but I think most of it is more private sector that, just operates not only in Latin America, but across the world.
Thank you very much. Let's go with the next question. This one is for Moises. So could you explain or give more of your insight about examples of how Iranians use, what are their tools for influence among the academic communities in Latin America?
Yeah, sure. But first, I want to remind that my talk was about, in a specific way, social sciences, and talking about academia, is a more huge concept. I was thinking about engineering in Iran. It's the most important subject in the country. Almost 7 from 10 people in university studies studies one kind of engineering. And engineering and other kind of, strong sciences in scientific laboratories, in private companies, put Iran in the most high standards in these matters around the world in indexes like Scopus and other international, very well-known indexes. So my talk was, and my view was about social sciences, which is the realm of politics is inside. And that's why the public discourse works like that in terms of social sciences and in a specific way, political science. Now, what I was saying is not an extraordinary from Iran or in specific for Iran, can be adapted to every single country around the world with the infrastructure to produce knowledge through mass media. American, CNNification, if we can say, in Latin America has been very useful for them for many years. The telenovelas, as Professor Sergio was saying, was a clear copy of this concept of produced television from American perspective in Latin America. This CNNification has been reproduced in many Mexican companies, for example, and this has been produced a double standard politics in Latin America, love and hate relation with US. And this is something that has been very well studied from many years ago. Now, in terms of the question that Marisabel was telling, the influence of Iranian regime, because Iranian community is very diverse in Latin America, and we have many good intellectuals in many Latin American universities. But talking about the Iranian regime, what I think is the most oriented, the direction of the question, is very small in universities. They try to work more in cultural terms in public events like Ashura ceremony, for example, which is the most important ceremony for Iranian Shia, the Ashari community in Iran. And little by little, Latin American governments are permitted to celebrate this kind of ceremony in the public space. Another tool that I can say is about the Farsi language teaching, which is the most common door that the Shia community uses to go to, what Professor Ken was telling about the ordinary people. There are people who want to break this idea of terrorism or criminality, of exotic image of Middle East. The first door they want to open is the language. And this is one important tool that the Iranian regime uses to go to ordinary people. The cultural projects in embassies, for example, the connections with embassy and institutions is another important tool. Sometimes the most of we know that embassies used to have at least 1 or 2 people from intelligence who what he does is just political observation. So it's very easy to have connections with this kind of people, with principals, directors in institutions trying to make connections in terms of international events, cultural events, and so on and so forth. So, and the other tool that I can mention is the organization of international events, promoting interchange from academics and from students from Latin America to other countries. This is, just like Juan Pablo used to say, very controlled mechanism. If Iran, for example, in Tehran University, in Faculty of Global Studies, organize one event, they invite the scholars that they think they're going to be useful for the event. They don't pay, because sometimes the institutions just to pay the trip, but they offer, accommodation and so on and so forth. and they control the visa statement, the visa processes with the Interior Ministry in Iran. So this is a very well control of these kind of connections. On the opposite, is very small. It's very small. People from Iran can come to Latin America, to Mexico, to many countries very free, but the level of including this kind of scholars in Latin American institutions, at least in Mexico, is very small, very poor. And I don't know if this is good or bad. I consider the Mexican Academy very free in some terms, not in journalism, because it's very sensitive, some topics in journalism, but in the academia, I think we can talk very free in many other topics. This is what I have to say about this question.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to have a second round. So, okay, so I have one more from Juan Pablo. You want to clarify something first before we give Thomas, Orchin, and Moises another chance to.
Yes, please. I just, regarding my last answer, I think I can share an example of what I was saying that I think is quite relevant because it's not an abstract example, it's something that I experienced myself. Just to show you how effective this strategy is, you know, of controlling the narratives through not only through the scholars and the academic world, but also, I mean, of course, also journalists and other people. But the example I want to share is that back in 2017, if I'm not wrong, there was this trip organized by China, four scholars only, to Tibet. You know that to go to Tibet, you need first a visa to enter China, and then you, as a foreigner, unless it's open to tourism, that in the last decade or so, it's normally has been closed. So you need a special permit as a foreigner. So there's no way you go into it's completely off limits for foreigners. So they took around a couple of hundred scholars from all around the world, you know? And fine, that's the only time I was in Tibet myself was through something like that, you know. I mean, it's not, I asked for permission to go. I was granted that permission, but once you land in Lhasa, you have someone from the government take you everywhere, and there's no way you can move around freely. So this is something that you need to know if you want to understand what's happening in Tibet. You're going to be monitored and probably escorted by officials. No, that's fine. I mean, that's how it works. But interestingly, after all those scholars were there for a few days, they all signed a joint declaration, which I find already sort of well, unique. No, I mean, you can go there. I mean, remember that this is being sold as a training trip, you know, in order to understand what's going on in Tibet. But effectively, it always ends up that those foreign friends, foreign allies, they end up signing some kind of declaration with, of course, the Party 9. Well, this happens. It's done by scholars. It's done by representatives of political parties. I mean, a whole bunch of people do this kind of thing. But what I experienced myself, that I happened to be in Buenos Aires at the time that those two Argentinian scholars were giving a speech on Tibet at CARI. CARI is one of, as you know, one of the main think tanks, not in Argentina, but in the whole Latin America. And I decided to attend as in the audience. I didn't intervene, just to see what kind of message they were passing along. And I was really shocked to see that despite whatever motivations those two scholars had, and they were not newcomers to the China topic, you know. I mean, they knew what they were talking about when they have a record of working on Chinese stuff for a long time, you know. I was really shocked to see that they were explaining to the audience exactly what they had been told during that trip, which, well, you can always say, well, I'm going to give you what the government, Chinese government tells you. Those are the figures. That's what they say. But immediately after, you probably should say, well, there's the other side of the story, which is all this repression and I mean, the dark story behind Tibet, as you all know. There was not a single word about all those very relevant episodes in the history of Tibet in the last decades, including Hanification and many other things, you know. So I wanted just to share this example with you, because if you were a part of the audience that day and you didn't know much about China or Tibet, the view that you got from those scholars that were not Chinese, they were Argentinians, in my view, was completely, completely different to what the truth is. But it's not about truth or not truth. It's about, well, you are a scholar, you need to give all the views, or you need to have a balanced approach to the topic, in particular, a topic such as Tibet, which is so controversial. But I think this is a good example, and of course, not all scholars are like that, not at all. I'm not saying that. Those two scholars have their own motivations, but at the end of the day, most scholars that follow China, they have to make a decision. You know, they have to make a decision if they want to engage in such a way, and if they want to keep their sources and keep traveling to China, etc. They have to pay a price for that. And if you don't want to do that, then you might your academic work, your professional work might be impacted.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Now, what I'm going to do is we only have less than 20 minutes. So I'm going to give you the questions ahead, and I'm going to go like in the order. First Thomas, then Orchin, and then Moises. I don't know if there is another question for Juan Pablo, because I think those two were there. So first, Thomas, what is your most likely scenario under a Biden presidency with Putin's and Russia's meddling in Latin America, not just in politics, but mostly when it comes to other more economic leaning activities? What could we expect from Putin with Biden on the in the White House, on the scene? What could we expect? I'm going to give all the questions, and then I'm going to give you a chance to answer. Orchin, same question. Now that we have a Democratic, or it's what's going to be likely the White House for the next 4 years with a different foreign policy agenda, how will Erdogan handle his relationship, not just with Maduro, but in general with Latin America? What should we expect from Erdogan related to Turkey, to Latin America under a Biden presidency? And Moises, today, the highest ranking Iranian expert on nuclear energy and power in Iran was assassinated. And there's some buzz in social media that this was probably most likely an operation led by the Israeli government, and without the US approval, it wouldn't be possible. So there's a lot of buzz going around about that. I would like to hear your thoughts about that, how that is going to impact Biden presidency, of course, but in general. So let's begin with Thomas.
Well, in terms of Russian activity in Latin America under the Biden administration, I don't think that Russia trusts any US president. I don't think they deeply trusted Donald Trump. He was convenient in some ways, but not a pal. And I don't think they trust any American president. So I think that they will basically continue everything they've been doing in Latin America with a goal to increasing Russia's visibility, doing economic deals that are that are advantageous to them. I think the main area for differences in Russian policy probably depends on Venezuela. If the United States and Russia come to some agreement regarding Venezuela, that could reduce tension over the Venezuelan issue, and that would be reflected in the tone and content of Russian information operations in Latin America. But I don't think that Russia will ever see Latin America outside the context to some degree of its relations with the United States. And since it will never trust the United States, I think it will always try to increase its influence in Latin America.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Now, Orçun.
Okay. From the perspective of the Turkish government, they didn't leave with Obama-Biden administration in good terms, because in the 2016 coup attempt, the Obama administration was rather ambivalent, and they didn't really condemn it fully. So Turkey was disappointed. That's why Trump was perceived as a more pragmatic person. But at the same time, in the first years of the Trump administration, Turkey and the U.S. had conflict about the arrest of Pastor Andrew Brunson, and then Trump, sent Erdogan this, very unprofessional letter, don't be a fool, and I will ruin your economy. So that also led to some anti-Americanism, and Turkey got closer with Russia. Putin and Turkey purchased S-400 missile defense system from Russia. Right now, the biggest fear among the Turkish government circles is whether Biden will impose sanctions on Turkey because of the S-400 missile defense system, as well as the past dealings with the Turkish Halkbank regarding the illegal gold trade with Iran. So there is, I think, the answer to your question is actually linked to both Russia as well as Iran, right? That Turkey's relationship with Biden administration will very much, depend on how Biden, takes an approach. If Biden goes hardcore on Turkey, Turkey might very well get closer to Russia, and that would maintain the relationship with Venezuela. If Biden works with Turkey, then Turkey could be a little bit more cautious with regards to Maduro, wouldn't push, try to get that close. But also Turkey and Russia, they have so much conflict in places like Libya and Syria. So including, I would say, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in Azerbaijan and Armenia, Turkey and Russia do not have fully overlapping interest. So I think with overall Latin American countries, I don't anticipate much change, but one factor, the Turkish economy is in the downfall, which will reduce Turkey's economic engagement with Latin America, because Turkish business, Turkish currency is not as strong anymore. So Turkish, businessmen do not have the same capacity to engage with the rest of the world like they used to be 5 years ago. So I think a lot will depend on what will go on with the S-400 purchase, and then the U.S. sanctions towards Turkey. So it's, again, Turkey they initially hesitated to recognize Biden as president-elect for a few days, but then they did recognize Biden as president. So they're not playing the Bolsonaro card, right? They're not, completely, associating themselves with Trump. So I think with Venezuela, again, Turkey thinks that it played on the right horse, right? That Turkey thought that Maduro was going to stay, and Maduro stayed. So Turkey is pretty happy that they didn't pick Guaido and then just broke relations with Venezuela. But I think the overall framework that I offered, that Turkey is more pragmatic, less ideological. It will work with pink tide governments. It will work with Luis Arce. It will work with Fernandez, Maduro, AMLO. But it will also work with Bolsonaro. It will also work with more right-wing governments. So I think a lot will depend on that triangle between Turkey, Russia, and the US. And Biden's approach to Russia and Turkey will determine, I think, a lot of that indirect policy towards Latin America. That's how I see it.
Great, thank you. That is a great point you're making. So Moises, I'm going to ask you a favor. Juan Pablo has to go, so let's give him a couple of minutes and then you will be our closing speaker. Juan Pablo, all yours.
Thank you, Moises. Okay, I think, I mean, the Chinese government is famous for being very pragmatic, and I don't think this is, I mean, they're going to deal with whoever is in office in Washington, and that's fine. But what I think is relevant is looking at it from the U.S. perspective, because what Trump did in relation to the U.S.-China policy is to raise the issue of things that were wrong in the bilateral relationship for a long time. I mean, we can discuss if the way his approach was correct, or if he would have done it in a different way, or if that is harming the U.S. In other parts of the world. I mean, this is a huge discussion. But what I think that the relevant thing here is that this debate about how asymmetric the relationship is, things like, for instance, the fact that China is able to invest in and take advantage of our open countries and our open democracies, to invest, for instance, in sectors that in China are closed or limited to foreign investment, things like that and many others, is exactly what Trump was raising, you know. And in some topics, he was, in my view, completely right, and in others, probably not that much. But what I think is relevant is that this debate is not going away because there's a change in office in Washington. And I think, in my view, I mean, myself, I've been researching about China for so long, and I've always said, and I've always written in different places, that it would be a problem when China would become a huge power, which China already is, in terms of the cohabitation with the rest of the world, and in particular with the US. Because it's the first time in recent history that a regime with whom we don't share any of the democratic values is at the same time a huge power. So that cohabitation, I predicted many years ago, among many other people, that something was going to be wrong, you know. And the very good example that we have here is what happened in Hong Kong, for instance, a few months ago. The good news is that I think that although in both the Democrats and the Republicans, there's a lot of people that are very pro-business and very pro-engaging with China, etc. I think it's good that the approach of Trump, maybe not the way he did it, but the basis of what he put on the table is really relevant in order to force China to engage with the world in a different way, in a more not under the Chinese terms, not I mean, things like being more transparent, being more open. I mean, things like that. It's a must that the rest of the world has to tell China to do. And I think Trump was the first one that did it and had the power to do it. And I think that with Biden, probably the way he will do it will be different. But I think that I don't know if the sanctions will remain and things like that. The approach will be softer, but I think that this attitude or this approach towards Beijing is going to remain.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Thank you for joining us. Now,
yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I need to leave, but I have an appointment in 5 minutes.
Our pleasure to
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share all of this, and it was very nice listening to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope you join us again. Thank you. Okay, Moises, all yours. You can unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Isabel. And very quickly, the public discourse that I was talking about is parallel to a proxy war, a historical proxy war in the Middle East, in which Iran, Israel, and the community of intelligence services of many countries from Russia, US, Syria, Iraq, many others, are participants, direct participants in this proxy war. So it's a vacuum of power right now in the Middle East. It's a fight between Turkey, Iran, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, in order to try to fool this vacuum of power. And Israel is one of the main actors who's concerning about the nuclear program, because the Iranian nuclear program is a challenge to the nuclear hegemony that Israel has in the Middle East. So I consider this assassination of today one of the most sensitive assassinations in Iran after the assassination of Abu Qasem Soleimani. Professor Farahzadeh, who is the assassinated person, was a Hyde Bank Pasdaran, So this is a very sensitive issue for Iranian security and for the opportunity to produce a self-critique about what's happening in the intelligence services in Iran. Because maybe they are very attentive to what academics are doing and activists are doing, but what about this kind of operations can be Israel, can be another service of intelligence, can be MKO, Mujahideen Khalq, which is the very important ally of Israeli government and Trump administration. I don't know who is behind this kind of designation, but is showing the lack of effectivity of intelligence services in Iran. And of course, I think this responds to the last actions by Trump administration before he leaves the presidency. So Biden has to clean the house. He is the main challenge he has if he wants to win the confidence of Iranian for come back to the Iranian nuclear deal, as he just has mentioned before. So this is a very huge challenge. Obama administration has many experience with Iran negotiation. It was a huge and very strong process of negotiation. Let's see if Biden has the ability to win the confidence of Iranian regime. But this can be another part of the history from the next year.
Thank you so much. Today, we really had a great conversation. I want you all to know that we really appreciate you joining us today. GAPAC is very proud to be starting these conversations, and with people like you with your expertise and knowledge and willing to share. We really do appreciate it. We are grateful, and we hope we can continue doing this. This was a great, great opportunity to talk about these issues that we are all interested in. So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope to see you soon. And well, that was great. Thank you.